Benito Mussolini was the world's first fascist dictator. His glorification of violence inspired Hitler. Mussolini used political theater. Hitler imitated him. Mussolini dreamt of restoring the Roman Empire, Hitler of even greater world conquest. Together, these two dictators started a world war that left 55 million dead. Yet in the 1920s, world leaders were full of praise for Mussolini and fascism for standing up to the communists. The Pope said he was sent by divine providence. Winston Churchill said Mussolini was the Roman genius whose triumphant struggle against communism had rendered a service to the whole world. This is the story of Mussolini and fascism, from its violent roots to its dream of empire, from its military disasters to its humiliating end. A story told for the first time in color. Fascism grew out of the bloody battlefields of the First World War. Italy had been fighting along with Britain, France and Russia against Germany and Austria. After 2 years of stalemate and brutal trench warfare, the Italian army cracked at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917.
Suddenly, the Austrians broke through the Italian lines, caused complete panic and havoc. A great deal of territory that was already Italy was lost, as well as the territory that Italy was fighting to gain in World War I. And it almost was a catastrophic rout that ended Italy's participation in World War I.
The Italian establishment was devastated by Caporetto, as 650,000 soldiers simply refused to fight, fleeing or surrendering instead. Among those on this desperate retreat was Ettore Ovazza, a member of a wealthy Turin banking family. Ettore had happily gone to the front with his brothers, believing, like many middle-class families, that war would build a glorious, revitalized Italy. Italy hoped to emerge from the war with an empire in Africa and a seat at the top table of European nations. But after Caporetto, Ovazza was overcome by shame.
I was riding at the head of a column of my own brigade, my head bowed, almost stupefied with anguish. I held myself in the saddle only with difficulty. My attendant came along beside me, weeping, and asked me, "Where are we going, Lieutenant, sir?" My jaw tightened, and I broke out in tears. And so we retreated.
Caporetto demonstrated Italy's military weakness to the world. It seemed that Italy was on the point of being forced out of the war completely. The nation faced ruin.
Caporetto was, of course, a military crisis, 1917, which then became a political crisis for the Italian government, the leadership as well, and for the main Italian political parties. It raised the question, first of all, whether Italy would be defeated. This would open Italy then to internal collapse and even to revolution. So Caporetto was a major crisis.
One man who rallied the public to defend Italy was Benito Mussolini, a 36-year-old journalist. At first, he'd been a fervent anti-war revolutionary socialist. Then he became passionately pro-war. He volunteered when Italy joined the war in 1915. He fought at the front, but was seriously wounded in a training exercise. Mussolini blamed his old comrades in the Socialist Party for the disaster at Caporetto. He believed their ceaseless campaign against the war had fatally undermined the army's morale.
World War I had been opposed bitterly by the working class, which didn't want to have to go fight a war it didn't understand. The Socialist Party in Italy had opposed intervention in World War I, had portrayed Italy's intervention as a capitalist war in which arms manufacturers and plutocrats were sending other people to war for their own gains.
Mussolini's former comrades became his bitterest enemies.
È in questo periodo, soprattutto con Caporetto, che egli fa un passo
It is here
ulteriore
that, especially after Caporetto, he makes another step in his political evolution towards nationalism. The only policy that Italy needed was a strong internal rule in order to fight the Austrian onslaught and, above all, to fight the internal enemies. It is here that Mussolini turns from socialist to nationalist. This was the start of Mussolini's war against the socialists.
Quella che sarà poi la guerra di Mussolini contro I socialisti.
Mussolini also hated the Vatican and the many Catholic pacifists who were opposed to the war. He felt they had betrayed Italy and stabbed the army in the back.
It was a tremendous humiliation for all patriots, tremendous, this great military collapse. And of course, they blamed, socialist and also Catholic propaganda for the collapse. They said the enemies of the nation have undermined the morale of the army. They are traitors and we must have, they must really be destroyed.
In Cremona, in northern Italy, railwayman Roberto Farinacci loathed Italians who had been won over by communism, which had just won power in Russia.
Italy is in danger because of terrible subversives. Everywhere masses soaked in false theories insult Italy and sing the praises of Russia.
Before the war, Farinacci had never been an extremist, unlike Mussolini. He was a socialist reformer, but strongly pro-war. He fought briefly but bravely at the front before being called back to Cremona. As a railwayman, he was deemed an essential worker. The humiliation of Caporetto turned Farinacci into a violent nationalist. One of his first targets was Catholic lawyer Guido Miglioli, an outspoken member of parliament for Cremona who opposed the war. Farinacci wrote furiously.
That man spread his poison throughout the region, incited the women to sabotage the war, the soldiers to depose their weapons, and the people to rise as they did in Russia. He deserved more. He deserved to be swept away forever.
To rally the troops after Caporetto, the government promised land to the peasant soldiers and good jobs for the rest. This stiffened morale, and with the help of her allies, Italy was eventually victorious in 1918. But the victory celebrations did not last long. Italy did not gain its expected spoils of war. No African empire, and only limited territory on her borders. Soon the mood of the nation was one of anger and despair. And everywhere was the looming fear of communism.
There's also, of course, all of the economic and social difficulties that follow the end of a great war. Demobilization, inflation, the problems of returning to peacetime production, and, of course, the threat of Bolshevism, which hangs over Italy as it hangs over most countries in Europe at this time.
Ettore Ovazza, the wealthy Turin banker who had been in a mass retreat from Caporetto, looked out on the city he loved and was enraged by what he saw. He saw not the disciplined society he desired, but the potential horror of a communist revolution. In the city streets below, there was near insurrection, with riots and looting. The middle classes feared their property would be seized.
a sizable part of Europe was living a climate virtually of civil war after 1918. This was true throughout Central Europe, was true throughout most of Eastern Europe as well, and this kind of climate of civil war encouraged political violence.
Ettore Ovazza feared revolutionaries would also rip apart the nation he loved. He wrote in his diary,
"In the nation, political hatred spread like wildfire. From the poisoned cities, intriguers spread out to plant the seeds of class war in the countryside. The young returning home, proud of having fought with honor, many with their brave bodies wounded, were downcast and alone, shoved aside as if guilty. This cry of anguish was heard by a man who was worthy of it, by Benito Mussolini."
It was a sign of the desperation felt by solid middle-class families like the Ovazzas that they should place their faith in a man like Mussolini. He was a radical figure, still against the Catholic Church and the monarchy. From an early age, Mussolini had politics thrust on him. He was born in 1883 in Romagna, in northeast Italy, an area known for its passionate left-wing politics. His mother was a schoolteacher, his father a socialist blacksmith. They named their son after the Mexican revolutionary Benito Juarez. At school he was a violent bully. He was even expelled for stabbing a fellow pupil. He became a schoolteacher, but despite his tough reputation, he was sacked for failing to control his class. Then he discovered journalism and revolutionary socialism.
And a man who'd been hailed by Lenin in Russia as virtually the only West European socialist who was really a Bolshevik kind of revolutionary socialist. So his main set of ideas were those of revolutionary Marxism. But Mussolini was never really an orthodox Marxist, despite this salutation from Lenin. He was always a Marxist who particularly emphasized the importance of the immediate revolution and of a violent revolution that had to be carried out by violent means now.
The experience of the First World War turned Mussolini from a socialist to a nationalist, but he retained his respect for violent action. On March the 23rd, 1919, Benito Mussolini and 200 people, many disillusioned former soldiers, gathered in the Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan. Among the leaders was Roberto Farinacci. They formed a new nationalist movement, Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. Fascio, meaning bundle or bunch, indicated strength through unity, but combattimento, or fighting, showed the aggressive intent of the movement from the start. Their manifesto mixed strong nationalism with socialism, with calls for an 8-hour day, retirement at 55, a minimum wage, and more land for peasants. But Mussolini always wanted the overthrow of what he saw as decadent liberal democracy. And he was not alone. Another violent nationalist was the celebrated Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Enraged by the government's weakness, he seized the port of Fiume with his own militia of veteran soldiers. Although it had a largely Italian population, Fiume had been handed to the new state of Yugoslavia after the war, infuriating Italian nationalists. D'Annunzio spoke theatrically from balconies and dressed his militia in black, the color of death, all traits Mussolini eagerly copied.
The first people who actually wore black shirts were, funnily enough, not strictly fascists. They were involved in what I suppose you could call a rather comic opera episode, the occupation of the city of Fiume by the great Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Because it was his followers who were called the Arditi, which meant the bold ones. They were mainly composed of sort of stormtroopers, people who had been shock troops in the First World War. These were the first group who at that time wore black shirts.
The elite Arditi Special Forces had been used to launch surprise attacks on enemy trenches and were famous for their close combat fighting. Mussolini loved their directness and violence. For him, the true spirit of fascism.
You represent the admirable warlike youth of Italy. The flash of your knives and the roar of your grenades will wreak justice on all the wretches who want to hinder the advance of a greater Italy.
The Arditi wore black shirts to signify the color of death. After D'Annunzio returned to his poetry, they formed the backbone of the fascists' own violent militia, the black shirts.
The importance of the black shirts is they are essentially a combat group. The name of the fascist movement is, of course, Fasci di Combattimento, which means fighting groups. And essentially they were, and made no bones about it, these were groups for street fighting and violence.
At a veterans' meeting in Turin, Ettore Ovazza eagerly joined the black shirts.
And Ettore Ovazza enters the fascist movement as part of a movement of veterans who are getting together and asking themselves, how can we prevent these terrible things that are happening from destroying the country we've been fighting to help create. And so he was a natural recruit for the fascist movement.
It was not at all unusual for Jews like Ettore Ovazza and his family to be fascists. Although violently nationalist, the fascists, unlike the Nazis, were not anti-Semitic and did not believe in racial superiority. 1 in 3 Italian Jews later joined the fascist party, and Mussolini's mistress was Jewish. Jews were strongly nationalist because the Risorgimento, the nationalist movement which unified Italy in 1870, ended persecution of the Jews and freed them from their traditional ghettos. Jews gained full equality. This allowed Ettore's family to found Banca Ovazza and become rich and respected. Now as a black shirt, Ettore Ovazza supported the fascist attack on those who seemed to be destroying the country he loved. But after the war, the fascists were not the greatest threat to the Italian state. In the years of 1919 and 1920, a socialist revolution seemed inevitable. Strikers occupied factories, peasants seized farms. These 2 years are known as the Biennio Rosso, the Red Years. The socialist advance seemed unstoppable. In September 1920, 500,000 engineering workers occupied 300 factories in Milan. The occupation spread to other cities. The liberal government seemed paralyzed as the militancy grew. At that moment, a socialist revolution on the Russian model might have succeeded, sparking similar revolutions across Western Europe.
The problem with the Italian Socialist Party is that it had a revolutionary ideology, but it didn't have a revolutionary leadership. The orthodox Marxist in the Italian Socialist Party said, look, Italy is not a fully fledged, mature, capitalist industrial state. We have to wait. And indeed, that was their famous slogan, all we have to do is wait. You wait until the circumstances permit.
The socialists were torn between seizing power through the ballot box or the bullet.
They were winning electorally very, very successfully, particularly at a local level. They were taking over vast swathes of northern and central Italy, which to the local landed elites in itself constituted a revolution.
In the 1919 election, the socialists became the largest party in parliament. So when the owners of the occupied factories finally conceded higher wages, the socialists chose the reformist path and accepted their offer.
But the great revolutionary moment had clearly passed. I think the key importance, perhaps, of the occupation of factories is everybody sees the Socialist Party's had its chance to launch a real attempt at revolution, and it's frightened, it's drawn back.
The fascists, including Ettore Evazza, saw themselves as the front line against the socialist threat.
You could not really be a regular member, if you were in the right age group, without being part of this militia. Now, in Italy, the black shirts were the basic core membership of the party. So this was a kind of special party army or party militia. There really had not been, in the preceding generation in all of Europe, any kind of political movement like that.
Evazza played his part by helping to destroy trade union offices in Turin. But although the fascists were active in the cities, fascism actually became a mass movement, much to Mussolini's astonishment, in the rural areas of central and northern Italy. Here on the flat, fertile plains, farm workers and their families tended to live in large cascine, farmsteads, where they were totally dependent on the owners. For centuries, this master-servant relationship had scarcely changed. But now this power structure was being challenged by the peasants. As the farming relied on back-breaking and labor-intensive work, the peasants knew that a strike lasting only a few days could bring ruin to the landowners. Therefore, the landowners became the natural allies of the fascists against socialists who were determined to set up workers' cooperatives to control the land. But the fascists also gained mass support from the 5 million peasants who had bought land for the first time when prices slumped after the First World War began.
So there is a mass of new landowners who are absolutely not willing to give up their land for a socialist revolution. These are the masses that gave birth to fascism. But there is also a vast mass of middle class who want to defend their property. It is they who will organize the fascist squads.
The tactics of the fascist squads were essentially tactics of violence. If they couldn't persuade or intimidate, then they simply used force to persuade people to abandon socialist trade unions, socialist peasant leagues.
Cremona in Lombardy was one of the strongholds of this uncompromising fascism. There, Roberto Farinacci was one of the most ruthless of the local leaders. Farinacci set out to break the power of the Socialist Peasant League, the Red League in the south of the province, and the radical Catholic leagues, known as the White League, in the north. The White League, headed by Farinacci's old opponent, Catholic lawyer Guido Milioli, had forced hundreds of landowners to set up small cooperatives where the peasants shared in the profits from the land. Milioli was thought by landowners to be almost as dangerous as the socialists.
He was a threat to the landowners because he'd really produced a kind of movement which set out to take away, not only to get just say to get higher wages or a bigger share of the profits, but to actually take over in large measure the organization of farming from the landowners. I mean, one thing which these movements succeeded in doing was telling the landlords how much labor they had to use. They would say, you have to employ so many workers. So it was a threat, I think, a threat to the real rights and control of property.
In just 1 year, Milioli's White League led a series of strikes involving 6,000 farm workers in 340 cascine. When crops were left to rot and barns were burnt, Farinacci's fascists set out to destroy both the Catholic and socialist organization. The black shirt squads in northern and central Italy had one great advantage on their side: mobility.
Increasingly, they worked according to a plan. They were organized in hit groups, and they were very good at obtaining support from local authorities. They very often, for example, were carried in lorries that belonged to the army, which had been loaned to them by local garrison commanders. And they organized themselves in absolutely military fashion sometimes in order to destroy the basis of socialist activity there.
Except in Russia, political violence was not seen in Europe before World War I. The idea of systematic political violence was a product of the war, expressed primarily after the war was over. But this was a new thing. This was a new kind of political style, and this was the sort of thing that in the main part of Europe was expressed more by fascism than by any other movement, even more than by communism.
The fascist action squads glorified violence for its own sake. They thought it powerful and purifying. And before long, this violence brought murder in its wake. Milioli wrote,
The first anti-fascist martyr in the Cremonese region was Giuseppe Paoli, a very dignified peasant who was loved and respected by all for his industry and honesty.
By the end of 1920, fascism was on the march in Italy. The motto of the black shirts was "Me ne frego," I do not give a damn. They considered life cheap, just as it had been in the trenches. When the socialists defeated the fascists in the May 1921 Cremonese provincial elections, fascist attacks intensified. What the fascists could not achieve at the ballot box, they were determined to achieve by force. Once again, the Catholic leader Milioli was badly beaten. Sometimes the victims of the black shirts were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. A person could be killed for wearing a carnation, the Socialist Party emblem. But often the deaths were the result of planned, systematic terror. In December 1921, Attilio Boldori, the Socialist Vice President of the Provincial Council, was kidnapped by Farinacci's fascists, taken to a cascina and beaten to death. Women and children were forced to watch, to learn the fate of those who opposed fascism. Fascist bosses in the northern provinces, like Farinacci, acted when and how they wanted.
The only thing I think one can say is that it was organized on a local level. It was organized by fascist bosses who usually were ex-officers. It wasn't, however, organized by Mussolini. There wasn't some kind of central directing plan. Very often, Mussolini didn't really know what was going on, and in the summer of 1921, he actually tried to stop the spread of violence because he was afraid that there would be a backlash and that the movement would lose its credibility as a parliamentary political force if the violence in the countryside continued.
The local fascist bosses were not concerned with parliamentary procedures. They believed socialism could only be eradicated by force. Farinacci didn't beat the socialist councils in Cremona in elections. He simply stormed the town halls. Again, Milioli was targeted. His apartment was set on fire. The Liberal government protested, but was fatally weak. It refused to send an armed force to restore order and reinstate the democratically elected officials to power. Instead, a commissioner with fascist sympathies was nominated to run the province. Violence had won. Farinacci proclaimed victory from the balcony.
Fascists of Cremona, socialists have lost control of the town hall forever.
The experience of Cremona was repeated across swathes of central and northern Italy. The fascists could see victory ahead. A liberal government was officially in power, but had little control over large chunks of Italy.
In
the beginning, the state didn't understand fascist violence and saw it as a reaction to socialist violence. After fascism destroyed the socialist organizations and imposed the fascist system in the cities of northern and central Italy, the state was no longer in a condition to suppress fascist violence. But there was also some sympathy from the state, as fascism claimed it wanted to defend the state, bourgeois society, property, and patriotic values, all those values that socialism deplored.
But fascism also had a very positive message.
It was very often accused of being the tool of the bosses, but the fascists were very successful at setting up their own alternative trade unions. And inasmuch as they were working alongside large landowners and, in broader terms, the middle class of the countryside and the small towns, they were in a position to offer work. In some cases even to offer small pieces of land. So they actually, yes, they had something really sort of practical to offer some of the people whom they were trying to win over.
They all built up these very powerful local machines, building a kind of totalitarian control, but only over single provinces. It was very local, but this sort of totalitarian control of single provinces. They really controlled everything.
Fascist success in rural Italy had a dramatic impact. By the end of 1921, the party had grown from 20,000 to over 200,000 members. And it tasted electoral success too. 38 fascists, including Mussolini, were elected to parliament. Fascist support was surprisingly widespread.
The hard core of the fascist movement were, in some sense or another, middle class. But there were also workers, and even some industrial workers. And one of the interesting factors, of course, is the presence of large numbers of students, out in a disproportionate way to their numbers in the population as a whole.
By the summer of 1922, the socialists had almost lost the will to fight in the face of fascist intimidation. The socialists made one final but fatal effort to stop the fascists by calling a general strike on August 1, 1922, to defend political and trade union freedoms. The strike was a failure. Strikers were replaced by fascists and the military. The fascists launched attacks on socialists and on trade union premises, often with the open support of the police and the army. The Times newspaper in London reported,
Fascismo has proved itself virile, well-disciplined, fearless and ready for emergencies.
When the general strike was announced, Farinacci rushed to join a mass fascist attack on strikers in Parma, a socialist stronghold. The black shirt attack was led by Italo Balbo, a local fascist boss. He knew he faced a tough task.
The city has remained almost impregnable to fascism. Business activity, council and government services have all ground to a halt over the last 3 days.
The leader of the strikers, Socialist MP Guido Picelli, knew the historic importance of the struggle.
If fascism were to win, it would mean suppression of all freedoms and a return to slavery.
Yet again, the state was an impotent bystander in this clash between two armed factions. Picelli described the scenes.
At dawn, when the order was given to get the guns out and launch the insurrection, working-class people took to the streets, as bold as the waters of a river which is bursting its banks. Men, women, old people, young people from all parties and from no party at all were all there in a single iron will. Resist and fight.
Fascist leader Balbo was secretly impressed.
Workers operate in shifts, military discipline. Working class women bring anti-fascists bread, wine, fruit and potatoes from the kitchen. They must have a large quantity of ammunition, because they don't spare their bullets, shooting day and night.
The fighting raged for 6 days, forcing Balbo to concede.
For the first time, fascism found itself facing a well-organized and well-trained adversary, equipped, armed, and prepared to fight to the finish.
Finally, Mussolini ordered fascist leader Balbo to retreat. A retreat that turned into a rout. 39 fascists were killed and 150 wounded. The socialist victory showed that fascism was neither invincible nor inevitable, as Picelli clearly understood.
If we were organized and disciplined, we would be strong enough to defeat fascism 1,000 times over.
But it was a false dawn. Across Italy, the socialists were tired of fighting. The defense of Parma was the socialists' last attempt to openly defy fascism for over 20 years. Mussolini realized he had an historic opportunity to strike. The socialists were beaten, the government weak, and the army sympathetic. Even the new pope seemed to smile on fascism. Mussolini decided to organize a mass march on Rome against the liberal government. The day before the march on Rome began, local fascist bosses like Roberto Farinacci violently seized power in provinces across central and northern Italy. On October the 28th, 1922, 25,000 black shirts converged on the capital, demanding power. It was an impressive show of strength, but fascism could still have been stopped. Giovanni Battista Amendola, a cabinet minister in the liberal government, was determined to defend democracy. He drew up a decree giving the army the power to use any force necessary to stop the fascists marching into the heart of Rome. The king, Victor Emmanuel as head of state, refused to sign the decree.
The main instrument of violence in Italy was the Italian army. The leadership of the Italian army was obedient to the crown. Had the king ordered the Italian army to suppress the fascists, the army would have obeyed, and the fascists would have been suppressed.
The next day, Mussolini was invited to Rome to form a new coalition government by the king.
He had seen his major enemies in Italy being the socialists and the communists, who wanted a revolution, wanted to depose the monarchy. He had seen the moderate political parties, the regular parliamentary and more democratic parties, divided, relatively impotent, unable to cope with the situation in Italy. Therefore, what the king was doing in October 1922 was simply making the leader of the most vigorous and dynamic new political movement parliamentary prime minister of a coalition government.
The Italian government had backed down in the face of fascist violence. Though Mussolini led a constitutional government, and there were only 3 fascists in the cabinet, he ensured that he could rule by decree for the first year, and that he was in charge of all of Italy's police forces. The king had inadvertently opened the way to a full fascist state under Mussolini's leadership. Ettore Evazza was delighted by the fascist seizure of power and the new order.
From the point of view of a conservative banker, the fact that strikes had been squelched, unions had been squashed, order had been restored, were all extremely positive events. You had a no-nonsense government that was whipping people into shape and bringing the country into order.
The fascists moved quickly and ruthlessly against the communist foes. The British consul in Turin was astonished at the openness of the fascists.
The kidnapping and murders in what might be called the socialist quarters of the city were carried out methodically, without the slightest interference from the Royal Constabulary. Not a single arrest was made. For all practical purposes, the communists are regarded as standing outside the protection of the law, and there are still some 20 socialists and communists on the proscribed list who are being hunted down for execution.
In a Turin villa, there was a rather more joyful scene. After his second son Riccardo was born, Jewish banker Ettore Ovazza placed symbols on the cradle to represent his three passionate beliefs: the fatherland, faith, and family. All, he believed, had been saved by fascism.
On the crib where my son rests, I have planted a tricolour flag, next to the name of God, written in ancient Hebrew script on a silver pendant. This lively tricolore note, tied with a blue ribbon, seems to illuminate the room.
At that moment, Ettore heard a military band marching down the street, playing the fascist hymn.
And he's so excited, and he grabs the child and takes him to the window and says, "Look at the new Italy being born, and how fortunate you are to be born into this new world." And it gives you a very touching and very human portrait of what a sincere, if deluded, Jewish fascist would have thought and felt at that time.
Ovazza and other fascists believed that their violence was cleansing the nation. They tried to intimidate all remaining opponents of the regime. In late 1923, Giovanni Amendola, the former liberal minister who had tried to stop Mussolini, was beaten unconscious by a gang of fascist thugs. When Mussolini heard of this assault, he remarked,
"Good. Tonight I shall dine with a better appetite."
But for all the violence, the fascists remained a minority party and still did not have total power.
This left one basic fundamental question, the question of long-term political power. How really to change the situation into a Mussolini government that would be more of a fascist regime that would keep him in power, because he had no blueprint.
In Parliament, Giacomo Matteotti, a highly respected moderate socialist deputy, accused Mussolini of being ready to use force if the next elections turned against him. A triumphant cry of "yes" went up from the fascist deputies. Mussolini nodded his head. In the elections of 1924, amid considerable intimidation, the fascist-led coalition claimed to have won 66% of the vote. But in June 1924, Mussolini was plunged into a sensational murder scandal that threatened to destroy him forever.
This was the Matteotti affair, the murder by squadristi of the leading spokesman of the socialist opposition in Parliament, who was kidnapped and stabbed to death, and found the corpse was eventually discovered in the woods outside of Rome a couple of weeks later. So this was a major crime and atrocity that even went too far in the eyes of many fascists and created a basic political crisis.
Matteotti's murder was arranged by Mussolini's close aides. In his newspaper Il Mondo, liberal parliamentarian Amendola launched stinging attacks on fascism over the murder.
39 million Italians are kneeling along the path of Matteotti from the site of his martyrdom to his final resting place. And today they will rise to defend those ideals that factions and tyranny cannot kill, but only strengthen and glorify.
The first 6 months after Matteotti was murdered in June of 1924 were a very difficult period for Mussolini. Several fascists had deserted him. Public opinion was very volatile. The opposition parties were trying to make a great deal of capital out of the situation. There was a real fear that he would be overthrown. Indeed, he himself, I think, more or less gave up at one point and thought, well, you know, this was it. This was the end.
But other fascists were not prepared to give up power so easily. Roberto Farinacci and 30 other fascist bosses threatened to kill Mussolini if he failed to keep fascism in control. Mussolini faced a choice between leaving power or stamping out all dissent once and for all. On January the 3rd, 1925, Mussolini strode confidently into Parliament. He did not even try to deny his role in Matteotti's death.
I declare before all Italy that I assume full responsibility for what has happened. Italy wants peace and quiet, and to get on with its work. I shall give it all these, if possible in love, but if necessary by force. In the 48 hours after my speech, the whole situation will be changed.
The January 1925 speech is the revelatory moment when fascism embarks upon the path towards dictatorship and the totalitarian state. He does it through a series of laws which eliminate the opposition deputies from parliament, which increasingly censors the press, which ultimately in 1926 leads to the dissolution of non-fascist parties and non-fascist trade unions, to the structures being put into place of a police state and a one-party state. The Vatican, like the monarchy, stayed silent.
One man did speak out, Amendola. The next day his newspaper, Il Mondo, said,
This man Mussolini constitutes a pathological case not foreseen in the Constitution. Everything is subordinated to his mad ambition.
But in the new fascist order, no opposition was tolerated. Amendola was hunted down by the black shirts and viciously beaten. Farinacci had no doubt that this was the right course.
I believe this will serve as a lesson in order to avoid bigger trouble.
It was Amendola who coined the term totalitarismo, totalitario, saying that what Mussolini was going for, though he was proceeding only step by step, in the long run was a total, what Amendola called a totalitarian dictatorship. And he was one of the most effective spokesmen for the opposition, and someone who refused to stop and refused altogether to shut up. That was why he was dangerous.
But he was soon silenced. Amendola suffered extensive damage to his lungs from the beating. On April the 7th, 1926, he died of his injuries. He was 44. In a final insult, a group of fascists sang cheerfully as they wrecked his house after his death. Mussolini was relieved to be rid of him.
We had only one foe, an inflexible one, Giovanni Battista Amendola. He wanted to overthrow us in order to found a democracy.
But democracy was now finished in Italy. Fascism and Mussolini had complete power. The question now was, what would he do with it? The answer would shake the world.